Chapter 19. The Bridge of the Great Canyon. Virginia's body fell into shock as she watched the fiery blast ripping across the plateau, racing toward her with menacing speed. She had time to draw only a single breath before the flames would consume her. Dawn broke over the land, shining its rays over the mountain. The sound of an eagle cried out overhead. A bright white light fell out of the sky behind Virginia. Two strong arms wrapped around her middle and two bright wings wrapped around her body, engulfing her like a cocoon. The dark fires hit the wings and consumed them in its path, but they could neither scorch nor burn through the feathers. Virginia opened her eyes. She saw a dark red fiery glow illuminating through the feathers that shielded her. She looked down and saw two strong arms enfolded around her middle and holding her close. "What?" "It's okay," whispered a voice into her ear. "I'm here." "Charles." Aniatha continued to unleash the fullness of the dark fires out of her hand at the wings shielding Virginia. Her face twisted in maddening rage, and her eyes burned with a deranged fury. The stream of her fire blast doubled in breadth, but could only spill around the winged cocoon like a rock in rapids, unable to singe a single feather. Tristan quickly drew an arrow from his quiver and attached it to his bowstring. He drew it back to his cheek and waited. Uriah flew down in front of him and cried out loudly. Tristan released the arrow. Whistling loudly, it cut through the air before running through Aniatha's hand. The fire stopped channeling through her arm. She pulled her hand back and cried out in pain. The fiery glow around the feathers stopped. Charles unfolded his wings and quickly spun Virginia behind him. He turned around and placed both wings in front of him like a shield. He drew his sword out behind his back and held it in his hands, ready for any attack to come his way. "Tristan! Nathaniel!" shouted Charles. "Get over the bridge!" Tristan raced to Charles's left, holding another arrow ready in his bow. Nathaniel ran over and stood to the right of Charles, wielding his hammer for any attack that may come. Being a wall of defense around Virginia, they all started walking back onto the stone lip of the bridge. "Nathaniel," said Charles, "take the lead over the bridge. Tristan, stay close behind him. Virginia, stay right behind Tristan." Nathaniel ran down the stone tongue and started walking across the wooden rope bridge. Walking backward, Tristan followed Nathaniel, holding his bow and arrow attached to its string in one hand while grabbing the rope railing of the bridge with the other. Virginia felt her feet touch the smooth, slippery rock through her shoes. She stood where the wooden planks met the stone lip. Far below was the misty bed of the Great Canyon. She looked up and saw Tristan and Nathaniel crossing the wooden bridge. The wind was more violent over the canyon, and the bridge looked like it would break at any moment. Its planks looked old and feeble, and its ropes began to fray in numerous spots along its railing. "Virginia," said Charles. She turned around and saw Charles staring at her over his shoulder and out of the corner of his eye with a smile on his face. "Nothing will happen to you," he said. Her hope returned to her. "Okay, this is it." She took a deep breath, grabbed the railing on either side with both hands, and took her first step off the solid ground and onto the dangerous, unpredictable bridge in front of her. Every stride was a hesitant one. Her legs and knees began to shake. Her breaths became short in the high air of the mountains. Her heart began to race out of control. Sometimes she thought it had stopped altogether. She was scared out of her wits, yet something inside her she could not describe gave her the strength and the courage to continue. She refused to look down, committing her gaze to what was before her. When she did, more hope flared up from within her spirit. In front of her, only about 100 feet away, was a jagged rock that shot out of the canyon bed below. In its middle was another stone slab, like the one behind her, stretching out over the vast canyon, and anchored to it was the end of the rope bridge. Ahead, she could see Nathaniel already off the bridge and walking onto the rock slab. Tristan was almost there and would soon stand next to Nathaniel. "I'm almost there," she cheered softly, strengthening her confidence. "I'm almost..." A pulsing shock forced the planks underneath her feet to roll in a whippling wave. Virginia bounced and bobbed up and down with the bridge as it quaked and rocked in all directions. Virginia's hands seized the ropes in her grip, while her feet acted like boats across a stormy sea. She screamed and shouted as the tide of rolling planks worsened. Her hands began to lose strength, while the bridge thrashed like a bull caught by its horns. Her heart froze as the rope railing slipped from her left hand. In mid-stride, she quickly reached out to grab it, but the tides of the bridge pulled her in one current while the rope bounced in and out of reach. Her back pressed against the right side of the bridge, while her upper body began to roll over the side. Fear gripped her soul. Suddenly, the bridge bounced and rolled again, forcing her to fall back into the center. Quickly, she snatched a rope running from the railing above to the planks below. With one hand on the rope railing and the other grabbing a rope baluster, she rolled with the plank tides, holding on for dear life. "What's happening?" she shouted. "What's going on?" She heard the pop of a bowstring in front of her. A faint, quick whistle cut through the air overhead. A monster cried in pain behind her.
Virginia turned her head over her shoulders, spotting Charles trying to stabilize himself, while a line of wolves clawed across the bridge.
The one in the lead carried an arrow in its eye. A second later, it collapsed, lifeless, to the bridge's floor, and soon slipped over the edge, falling to the canyon depths below. Virginia looked ahead, spotting Tristan racing across the bridge back in her and Charles's direction. He would race a few paces, pause, and lean against the rope for support while stretching another arrow back to his cheek. Virginia heard Uriah squawk behind her, near the wolves. A second later, Tristan released his arrow. Virginia turned her head around fast, following the arrow as it soared through the air, splashing into the flesh of another wolf coming their way. The beast barked and cried out in pain before tumbling off the side of the bridge, vanishing into the misty floor below. "I'm running out of arrows," shouted Tristan, drawing another from his quiver. "Hurry, come on!" Virginia's skin crawled as she heard a bark directly behind her. Timidly, she turned her head and saw a wolf no more than 30 or 40 feet behind them, its eyes focused on her as it lowered to the bridge floor, preparing to leap. "Charles!" she shouted. Charles followed her gaze and saw the wolf behind them. "Virginia, just keep going." "What?" she screamed. "What are you going to do?" A second later, the wolf launched off the bridge, sending a violent wave rushing across the bridge in their direction. Charles clapped his wings and leaped into the air, sword ready in his hands. Virginia watched as the two made a perfect arch in the air as they flew at one another. Charles pulled one wing in front of his body and the other covering his back while twirling his sword around, bringing the point out in front of him. The wolf opened its jaws wide and stretched out its razor-sharp claws, readying to wrap Charles in its grip. The two collided in the air. The wolf wrapped its front arms around Charles, grabbing both of his wings while biting down on the wing in front of him. Both man and beast descended from their collision spot, fell past the bridge, and faded out of sight into the mist below. Virginia's heart sank as Charles vanished out of sight. "Charles!" Her heart panicked inside her. At the sound of a deepening growl behind her, she turned to focus down the bridge, spotting another wolf marching an awkward crawl across the bridge and closing in on her. The beast was no more than 20 feet away. Another faint whistle sliced through the air above. A second later, the wolf collapsed to the floor. Another wolf appeared behind him as he fell. The Forest Phantom kicked his dying comrade over the edge of the bridge while it crawled closer and closer to Virginia. Another arrow sliced through the air and sank deep into the monster's throat. The creature gagged and choked its final breaths before tumbling over the edge and joining his comrade. No more than 40 feet behind the slain wolf was another, slowly crawling toward her. Virginia heard footsteps approaching behind her and soon felt a hand slide underneath her arm, trying to pull her up amidst the relentless chaos of the swaying bridge. "Come on, Virginia," said Tristan. "We have to keep moving. Now!" The wolf barked louder. Virginia and Tristan looked ahead and saw the wolf was closer than before, lowering himself to the planks and preparing to leap. Tristan attached his bow behind his back and squatted down behind Virginia. He drew his sword, placing the edge of the blade in front of Virginia. "No matter what happens, make your way to the other side as fast as you can," said Tristan. "Do you understand me?" Virginia grabbed Tristan's cloak. "No, don't, please. I don't want you to die too. Please." Tristan rested his hand against Virginia's fist, trying to unfold her fingers gently and quickly from his cloak. "Just do what I said and make your way to the..." A loud, piercing cry blasted from the canyon floor, below like a trumpet. Virginia and Tristan looked over the edge of the bridge. A bright orb glowed in the depths of the clouds and continued to grow brighter and brighter at a fast pace. "Hold on!" screamed Nathaniel from behind. "Hold on to the bridge!" Tristan and Virginia looked back at Nathaniel, who had taken hold of the bridge's anchor ropes in each of his hands and braced both feet on the ground. "Al Kobita!" shouted Nathaniel. "Tristan! Al Kobita!" Tristan gasped and looked down. The light was climbing faster and faster toward them. "He's right," said Tristan. "Wait, what?" asked Virginia. "What's Al Kobita?" Instantly, Tristan sheathed his sword and gripped Virginia's wrist. "Hold on to the bridge." Tristan, what's going on? What's Alcobita? Just hold on tightly, shouted Tristan, gripping one of the rope balusters. Tristan? It was a similar bridge we fought on years ago, he finally answered. Same situation. We couldn't outrun our enemies, so Soaring Eagle had an idea. Virginia gripped the bridge tighter. Tristan, what idea? Don't worry, it worked. Surprisingly. Tristan? A loud bark caught her attention. She turned her eyes back to the wolf. Its powerful jaws dripped with saliva from its big razor-sharp teeth. Another second, it would be in midair. And another second, it would be on top of them. Another loud, ghostly cry echoed from the misty floor. The wolf paused and looked over the edge, as did Virginia. A bright star emerged from the misty blanket below and rushed toward them. Virginia's heart skipped with excitement and joy. She followed the star as it raced closer and closer to them, gaining more speed with each clap of its wings. The wolf focused its attention back on Virginia and barked loudly. Virginia looked at the monster as it once again held her in its gaze and prepared to pounce. The wolf's legs sprung beneath him, and the bridge began to ripple. At that very moment, the bright light rushed between Virginia and the wolf, and a shimmering blade sliced across the bridge in a wide uppercut stroke. The shockwaves ceased, and the waves finally broke their chain reaction. Virginia felt her body beginning to fall, along with the rest of the bridge. "Hold on tight!" shouted Tristan. Virginia screamed and gripped tighter to the ropes as they began to swing with increasing momentum towards the peak to which the rope bridge was anchored. The rope bridge anchors snapped from their foundation. Nathaniel's muscles rippled and tightened as he firmly held the end of the bridge in both hands. His feet slid against the smooth rock, pulling him closer to the edge. He forced himself to the ground and placed each foot against two jagged rocks. Pressing his heels against his footing, he held on to the ropes in his hands like the reins of a sled, gritting and grinding his teeth against their force. Tristan and Virginia held tightly onto the rope bridge as it arched in the air and raced head-on to the rocky peak. "Oh, this is gonna hurt," shouted Tristan. "Tristan!" shouted Virginia. Virginia closed her eyes and turned her head away as the rope bridge rolled into the side of the rocky peak. She and Tristan yelled in pain as their bodies smashed into the stone structure. Amidst the swelling excitement and chaos, Virginia began to hear Tristan laugh. "Did you hold on tightly?" he asked. Virginia looked up at him. She was unsure if the pain caused his nervous laughter or if it was just Tristan being Tristan. They looked across the canyon back at the mountain, watching in relief as the other half of the bridge collapsed into the mountainside, sending the last of the wolves on its planks sliding off to the canyon below. A loud bark echoed below them. Horror once again consumed Virginia's heart. She looked down and saw the wolf staring at her moments ago, hanging onto the severed end of the bridge for dear life. Its flaming eyes burned with blinding rage, and the muscles in its arms began to tense as it climbed toward them. "Hurry!" screamed Tristan. "Climb!" Virginia slipped her fingers between the planks and began to climb up the bridge like a ladder, with Tristan leading the way. "Oh, great!" shouted Tristan. "What now?" Virginia called back. She looked up and saw him staring back at the top of the mountain. She turned around and saw the fire twister walking out onto the stone tongue where the other side of the bridge was anchored. Aniatha looked down at Virginia and Tristan. She extended her left hand out towards them. A spiraling fire began to channel down her arm, forming a flaming orb at the end of her palm. A stream of fire blasted out of her hand and raced through the air at Tristan and Virginia. A loud squawk, like that of a hawk, echoed above them. Virginia looked up and saw the star torpedoing down toward them. He fell beside Tristan and threw his sword into the rock facade, slicing through the structure like a hot knife through butter. Quickly he reached down, snatched Virginia in his arms, and wrapped all three of them in his wings, like a cocoon on the side of the mountain. The fire blast smashed against them, but could not scorch them or the wings. "Oh, I hate her stupid fire," grumbled Tristan, his voice echoing in the small feathered chambers. "I hate her stupid fire. I hate it." Virginia held onto Charles's arm and tucked her feet up high underneath her. "What do we do now?" "Hope that Nathaniel thinks of something clever," snarked Tristan. Nathaniel looked across the vast space as Aniatha blasted her fire down at his friends. Quickly, he looked around for anything to help them. His eyes widened as he spotted his hammer. Releasing the rope bridge with one hand, he reached over and grabbed the handle of his weapon. He looked across the vast space at the stone cleft that Aniatha stood on and smiled. "My turn." With a strength that ran deep within his blood, he hurled his weapon across the canyon. Like a tomahawk, it twirled and soared through the air. Eniatha saw something racing through the air with menacing speed out of the corner of her eye, but had zero time to react. A second later, the head of Nathaniel's hammer smashed into the stone cleft upon which she stood, exploding the rock foundation into 1,000,000 pieces. Eniatha and any wolves standing beside her were thrown back in the shockwave. "What was that explosion?" asked Virginia. Suddenly, the fire stopped. "Ready to run, Tristan," said Charles. "You know it, brother," said Tristan, wrapping his arms around Charles. With Tristan holding on to his left arm and Virginia in his right arm, Charles drew his blade out of the mountain and clapped his wings. The three of them jumped up the side of the rock foundation, but not in mid-flight. Rather, Charles and Tristan began to run along the side of the peak, while Charles thrust their charge with a continual clapping of his wings. "Come on, Virginia," cheered Tristan. "Rush!" Virginia reached her feet out and did her best to race along the rock wall, while Tristan and Charles appeared to have more practice in their strides. A familiar bark down below sent a chill up Virginia's spine. She looked down and saw the wolf charging up the side of the facade behind them. "My goodness, he's persistent," said Tristan. "Let's talk! More running!" shouted Charles. The three raced and hopped up the side of the peak, with the wolf hot on their heels. The edge of the peak came closer and closer into view. It was 30 feet away, 20, 10. With their final running leap, they jumped over the edge of the peak and tumbled behind Nathaniel. "Nathaniel!" shouted Charles. "Forest Phantom!" Nathaniel let go of the ropes in his hands, stood up, and clenched his hand into a fist. The next second, the wolf climbed over the edge and leaped at them all. Nathaniel pulled his fist back and with a loud yell threw it at the oncoming foe. A shockwave exploded between Nathaniel and the wolf that sounded like cannon fire, shaking everyone's clothes in its path. The wolf launched like a rocket across the canyon before smashing into the mountain on the other side with a loud crash. All four fell to the stone floor beneath him, panting heavily. What on earth was that?" asked Virginia. Nathaniel turned his head around. "What was what?" "That hero's punch thing you just did. I felt like I was standing behind a cannon." Nathaniel smiled and held up his fist. "Like I said yesterday, the strength of the Hezekiahites." Virginia's eyes widened. She looked back and forth between Nathaniel's fist and the small crater the wolf made into the mountainside across the canyon. "Oh," she said, breathing heavily. "Okay, then." "We need to move," said Charles. "I'm all up for resting, but let's just rest on the other side of this peak, out of reach of her fire." Nathaniel walked over to Tristan and reached down to grab his hand. "Ready, brother?" Tristan lay on the stone slab, breathing heavily. "Care to carry me the rest of the way?" Nathaniel smiled and grabbed Tristan's ankle. "No, but I can do this." Nathaniel proceeded to walk, dragging Tristan by his leg across the bumpy rock foundation. Wait, shouted Tristan. I'll walk. Nathaniel released his foot. He reached down, took Tristan's hand, and pulled him up to his feet. "Hey, where's your hammer?" asked Tristan. "Threw it across the canyon at Eniatha," replied Nathaniel. Tristan looked at the mountainside, noticing the shattered remains of where the rope bridge was once anchored. "Oh, that was you that made that explosion sound." Nathaniel smiled victoriously. "And I see you're all out of arrows." "Indeed. So we're all armed with the swords on our backs and our good looks. What's the worst that can happen?" Nathaniel chuckled. "You lost your hammer?" said Virginia sorrowfully. "I'm sorry. You seem to like that thing." Nathaniel waved his hand in the air. "Nah, don't be, Your Highness. I've got plenty more just like it at the city of Gaal." Charles reached down, took Virginia by her hand, and helped her off the ground. "Let's move," said Charles, "before we become sitting ducks." Nathaniel led the way, walking on the stone path that circled around the peak. Tristan followed him, with Uriah hopping along the ground before him. Virginia followed him, but came to a sudden stop. She placed her left hand along the cold stone wall beside her and closed her eyes. "What's wrong?" asked Charles. Virginia shook her head. "I can't keep doing this. I can't do this." "Yes, you can, Virginia." Virginia shook her head abrasively. No, I cannot. This is too high for me. There's no railing for me to grab onto this time. This rocky path up here is wet and slippery, and I almost fell to my death a moment ago." Charles looked over his shoulder at their enemies regrouping and then back at Virginia. "The fear is all in your mind. You can do this." "Stop! Just stop, Charles. I can't. And I know I can't." Virginia felt Charles's two strong hands gently grabbing her shoulders from behind. "Then I'll help you," he said. "We've made it this far together." He stretched out his right wing and placed it beside Virginia, separating her from the cliff's edge. "Hold on to my wing. Let it be your railing." Virginia opened her eyes and saw the bright wing wrapping around her right side like a blanket. She reached out and touched the softness of its feathers. Turning her head around, she looked up into Charles's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She turned her head back around. A smile stretched across her face. A warm feeling rose in her stomach and slowly melted away all fear, calming her nerves just enough to allow her legs to move. She began to walk around the peak while holding onto his wing. "You're doing beautifully," he said. Virginia smiled. "Beautifully?" And here we are. Coming into view around the bend was another bridge that stretched out about 350 yards to another massive stone pinnacle shooting out of the canyon below. She could see Nathaniel already making his way down the bridge, followed by Tristan, who was whistling to a tune in his head. "How can Tristan be that relaxed about all of this?" asked Virginia. "He's walked the unknown for a very long time, in a way that none of us can fully relate to," said Charles. "He's used to this kind of environment and has a faith that tackles all worry. Many times I wished I was as brave as he is." Virginia walked to the start of the new bridge. Charles slowly drew his wing back as she grabbed onto the rope railing and gently lifted his hands off her shoulders. "You can do this," he said. "I'll be right behind you all of the way." Virginia looked into the ever-growing distance ahead of her. "How much longer will this take?" "About 10 more minutes." 10 more minutes. Just 10 more minutes. Virginia took a deep breath and stepped off her first breaking point and onto another bridge. The walk was not as long as she had imagined. By keeping her eyes closed and only opening them when she felt like a plank was loose, Virginia soon found herself stepping off the wooden bridge and onto the new stone apex. In front of her was a tunnel, hewn through the pinnacle of rock. "Through the tunnel?" asked Virginia. "Through the tunnel," responded Charles. Virginia wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and walked through the dark tunnel with uncertainty. It was cold and wet inside. She could see her breath when she exhaled. Water trickled down upon the pathway. She threw the hood of her cloak over her head to repel any drops from hitting her. The mountain wind howled as it rushed through the tunnel. Virginia would have turned back if not for the light of Charles's stomach and wings illuminating the atmosphere. "Virginia," said Charles, "look." Virginia turned around and saw Charles placing his hand on the wall. She came and stood beside him. Carved into the stone wall, where he rested his hand, was a picture of two men grabbing hands through a mountain. "What is it?" she asked. "A memorial. A reminder. This was carved ages ago after the Great Division formed the Great Canyon. The tribes of the woods of Earthstars and the remaining survivors of the people of Amya remembered their strong bond and friendship. To keep this friendship alive, one man from each side of the canyon, with the wings of Oralmuti, flew from peak to peak, stretching and constructing the bridge we are crossing now. With the metal of Oralmuti, they hewed through this stone peak and created this tunnel. It was considered a sign of hope, a miracle. Both of their tunnels just happened to meet in the middle. It was the first time that an Amyahi, someone from the waters of Aletheia, and one from the tribe of Earthstars had seen each other since the division of the lands. To commemorate that day, they etched into the wall this picture of them shaking hands through the mountain, reminding the people that hope remained for their descendants. Both peoples will once again become one kingdom, as in the days of old. Virginia looked at the wall, mesmerized. She touched her fingers over the carving, feeling every cut made by the chisel that hewed it. "It's so beautiful." Caught in wonder, and without guidance, she trailed her hand across the picture. Suddenly, she felt her hand fall upon something warm. She came out of her daze and fell into a new one as she found her hand resting upon Charles's hand. She looked up at him, and their eyes locked. The world faded away as they fell into a new dimension. She inched closer to him and placed her other hand on his chest. Leaning upon him, she reached her lips up towards his. Charles quickly pulled his hand out from underneath hers and placed his fingertips on her chin. The atmosphere dissolved. Virginia opened her eyes and found herself back in the tunnel. She looked up into Charles's glowing eyes, confused. "Wait," he said softly. "Wait. What did I do?" "I'm sorry." "You didn't do anything. Everything's okay." I hurt him. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Nothing is wrong. I just can't. I'm sorry." "What did I do? I know I did something to hurt him. What did I do?" "I'm sorry." A warm smile crossed his face. "Virginia, you are okay. Don't worry about it. It was not you. It's me." He looked up into the distance at the far end of the tunnel. "Come. We have to continue." With Charles guiding her with his hand, Virginia turned around and continued down the tunnel. What did I do? The moment. Was the moment wrong? I felt it. Did he not feel it? I thought I saw it in his eyes. Her eyes shot open. Does he even want to kiss me? Does he even like me? Is there someone else that he likes? The light at the end of the tunnel fell upon Virginia's eyes, catching her attention. In front of her was a new bridge, leading to another peak, and beyond that, Virginia could see a new mountain falling into a new land. The sight was beautiful, enough to catch the attention of any man. What did I do wrong? Virginia casually stepped onto the new bridge and began to walk. What did I do? I thought he liked me. If he ever did like me, I'm sure he's turned off by now. I bet he's keeping his distance behind me, not wanting to be anywhere near me. Virginia suddenly stopped in her tracks and waited. She felt a chest suddenly run into her back. Virginia, is everything okay? Asked Charles. He's walking right behind me. Those woods in the far distance are the ones that we're going to. They consist of many red pines, but then it eventually fades into new kinds of trees that look similar to those back home in Tennessee. I think you might like it. He's right behind me. What does that mean? Virginia, are you okay? He's talking to you. Say something. Yes, I'm fine. I'm just groovy. Groovy? Groovy? Virginia tightly closed her eyes. What are you doing? Charles let out a little chuckle. Well, are you groovy enough to continue, or do you need to rest? No, I'm good. No, you're not. Who are you fooling? With one foot in front of the other, she continued down the wooden bridge. She lowered her head, letting her hood fall farther over her face, retreating deeper from the world. She looked down and stared aimlessly at the wooden planks she crossed over while her mind spun in confusion and bewilderment. It was only by the sound of Tristan's whistling that she eventually looked up and saw she was about to walk on the new rocky breaking point. She stepped off the wooden bridge and onto the new summit. This breaking point was more of a plateau, yet it had the roughest rocky terrain of them all. In front of Virginia, Tristan continued, still whistling to a tune. Further along the path was Nathaniel, who was at the start of the last wooden bridge. We will have to be a little more careful on this next bridge, said Charles as they approached it. There are a few planks missing, so be careful to watch your step. Well, he's still talking to me. That's good, right? Okay. Virginia stepped on the bridge, but did not grab the rope. Instead, she wrapped her hands around herself, holding her cloak close to shield her from the wind. She looked up from the wooden bridge and gazed into the morning sky. The sky's dark blue color was beginning to shade into a lighter blue contrast. It's so peaceful. Virginia, watch your step, said Charles. I am. 2 planks suddenly broke beneath her feet. Virginia's legs slipped through the new hole in the bridge. She screamed and caught herself with her arms. She had a split second before the planks she held onto broke in half. Her support was gone, and she hurled to the misty canyon below. Everything happened within a matter of seconds. The wind rushed past her face, and her hair danced in long strands that blew upward as she looked at the hole she had fallen through. The bridge was big, but a second later it was nothing more than the size of a long toothpick. Something like a bird leaped over the bridge, folded its wings close together, and torpedoed down to the bottom of the canyon towards her. Life paused for the next 3 seconds for Virginia Singerman. The misty fog of the canyon engulfed her, the bridge, the morning light, the mountains, Charles, everything had vanished out of sight. She turned her head around and looked down and below her. The final end could not be seen. Nothing awaited her except the expectation of a rocky bottom and a shroud of mist. God, I'm sorry, she cried out. I'm sorry. A massive force slammed into her side. 2 arms wrapped around her. She went from free-falling to flying like a jet through the mist. With a slight tilt, she found herself soaring upward. The morning light began to bleed into the mist. The thickness of the fog dissolved. Virginia shot out of the misty pit and aimed toward the sky. The wind rushed past her face with such extreme force that her eyes began to water. She felt her body pivoting into an arch. What once was the sky in her view now became the ground. With the same speed, she flew back down to the earth, like a missile falling out of the sky. She screamed and closed her eyes. The 2 arms pulled her in tightly. Virginia did 2 front flips before suddenly being pulled back up. All became lighter than air. She opened her eyes and saw that she was floating to the earth as if a parachute held her. Before her feet touched the grassy earth, she saw a pair of moccasins land, followed by her feet directly behind them. The 2 arms slowly let her go, and Virginia stood on solid ground. She looked down at the pair of moccasins and looked up into Charles's eyes. A soft, warm smile was on his face as he returned her gaze. Are you all right? He asked. The reality of how close death nearly seized her life overtook her. Virginia began to shake. She fell, crying, onto Charles. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close. Shh, he whispered into her ear. It's all right. It's over. After a long moment, he pulled her head back and wiped away her tears with the feathers of his wing. You're safe. Virginia did not know if she was laughing or crying, but joy began to flow out of her. She wrapped her arms around him and placed her head against his heart. Thank you. Thank Oral Muti. There's no way I could have found you in that fog on my own. But you still jumped after me. Then I thank Oral Muti too. Virginia felt the warmth of dawn's morning glow lightly kiss her cheek. She looked and saw all the breaking points that she had crossed. She saw the mountain she had climbed, a thin smoke billowing around it. She saw the woods that she had hiked through fading into the distance. Everything was covered in a blanket of light, and not one of her foes who had been hunting her had crossed the canyon. She was safe. My goodness, girl, exclaimed a voice from behind. You gave us quite a scare. Virginia released Charles and turned around. Approaching her were Nathaniel and Tristan, running up with widespread arms. They tackled and picked her up in the air as both held her simultaneously in a big bear hug. Virginia's joy and excitement spilled out of her in laughter. Both companions set her back down on her feet and untangled their arms around her. Quite the thrill-seeker, aren't you? Joked Tristan. Virginia was still shaking. She laughed and shook her head. Don't be fooled. I'm not that dangerous on purpose. Well, that's not good, said Nathaniel, pointing a thumb over his shoulder, because you'll need to be wild and dangerous to make it through those woods. Virginia's joy began to be pushed out by worry. She looked up into Charles's eyes. She can handle anything in these woods, said Charles. In which case, let's put a move on it, said Tristan. Charles looked at Tristan and gave him a nod. Lead the way, my good man. Tristan smiled, turned around, and walked down the steep hill into the woods of the red pine. Nathaniel gave Virginia a strong pat on her shoulder. You thought those woods were fun. Wait until you see these. Nathaniel turned around and hiked down the hill with Tristan. Charles walked past Virginia and followed Nathaniel. Don't let him worry you, he said, walking past her. You'll be just fine. Virginia watched Tristan disappear into the edge of the shadowy pine woods as he trailed further down the hill, followed by Nathaniel. She looked at Charles, watching the wings on his back as they slowly folded and dissolved into his back. She smiled at him. I guess we are both okay then. She turned her head and looked into the east. The morning sun was casting its light upon the land, the mountains, the woods, the valleys, and the bridge. Though she could not see it, she knew that somewhere on the other side of the Great Canyon was their old campsite where she had slept last night. Beyond that was the spot where she had met Tristan and Nathaniel for the first time, and beyond that, the tribe of the Naomi, and beyond that, the gate that led her into this world. She slid her thumbs under the straps of her backpack. I'm so scared. I want to go home, but I don't want to go home. What do I do? Virginia, came Charles's voice. Virginia turned around and saw him looking back at her. Are you coming? He asked. Virginia turned her head back to the east and breathed a farewell to all hopes of turning back. Yes, I'm coming. She turned around and walked down the hill towards Charles. The red pines of the woods grew tall and mighty, producing a robust and soothing aroma. She walked up to Charles and they journeyed together in the woods. Are these woods as dangerous as Nathaniel says they are? Asked Virginia. Charles took a long time before responding. No matter what, just stay close to us. Aniatha stood on what was left of the broken stone slab where the bridge was once anchored. The dark fires that swirled around her dissolved away, along with the wall of fire that followed her. Tristan's arrow was still lodged through the flesh of her hand, soaking her palm and fingers with blood. Her hair and red dress trailed in the mountain wind as she saw her prize escaping in the distance. Her eyes began to water. Her face turned red. You'll never do anything right. You'll never do anything right, whispered a voice to her soul. Blood emanated out of her hand faster and dripped onto the stone pavement beneath her as she tightened her fist. At the far opposite end of the plateau, a large black werewolf climbed the edge of the stairs. He stood on all fours on the tableland, looking worriedly at Aniatha in the distance. A dark cloud fell and engulfed him out of sight. A noise sounded like bones shifting and snapping in and out of place. Out of the same dissipating black cloud rose Darkcry. His long black hair and dark trench coat fluttered in the same wind as Aniatha's dress and hair. He steadily walked towards her, trying to arrange the right words to say upon his arrival. The closer he drew to her, the more fear began to blur his script. He walked onto the stone lip and stood behind her. Taking a deep breath, he attempted to console her. "My love."
Without warning, Eniatha whirled around,
Grabbed Darkrai by his coat and kicked him down to his knees. With the arrow still penetrating through her hand, she placed the razor-sharp point at his throat. "If you have absolutely nothing to say that will make this moment better, then you would be wise to hold your tongue before I cut it out," she said through her teeth. The blood trickled down from her hand, fell upon Darkrai's collarbone, and ran down his chest. He carefully placed the palm of his hand upon her cheek. "I know someone who can help." A small glimmer of hope softly sparkled in Eniatha's angry eyes. "Who is it?" Darkrai paused a moment before continuing. "We both know who. As much as I hate to admit it, we need his help from this point on." Eniatha lowered her bloody hand and released Darkrai's coat. She looked back across the canyon, thinking deeply and exhausting all options before looking back at him. "Then take me to him." "Yes, but my love, your hand." Eniatha's eyes inflamed. Grabbing the front of the arrow, she pulled the rest of it through her hand, ripping its guiding feathers through her flesh. She tossed the bloody shaft to the ground. Blood began to stream out of her wound faster. She tightened her damaged hand into a fist as a dark shadow, and a burst of fire fell upon her injured hand. Moments later, the shadow dissolved and the fire faded. She opened her hand. The skin of the entry and exit wound grafted back together, not even a scar was seen. All that remained was old, dried blood coating her hand. "I said take me to him," she shouted. "Do it now."
This is the end of Chapter 19. Tune in next Thursday for Chapter 20. If you'd like to listen to the next chapter ad-free ahead of everyone else, then subscribe to Early Access and tune in on Sunday. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family. It really helps the show. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcasting platforms. What Shines with the Dawn was written and created by C. Taylor Eason. Copyright Christian Taylor Eason, 2024.